I want to thank everyone for coming today. We want to get started. Congressman Burgess needs to go back up to Capitol Hill for a hearing this morning that the Energy and Commerce Committee is holding. I want to welcome everyone to AI for this discussion on how we'll enable access to medical cures. With new platforms such as cell and gene therapy and more targeted drugs in development, for the first time we're really looking at a pipeline of medical products where the aim isn't just to temporize disease or even reverse its course, but the aim is to curtail the disease process itself. But there are some challenges to realizing these opportunities. One is, how can we make the process for finding medical cures lower cost and more efficient so that we can create more opportunities for these kinds of treatments to be developed in the first place and to reach patients? And the second is, once we have these opportunities, perhaps in the form of new drugs or even things like cell and gene therapies that can resolve the underlying mechanisms of inherited disease, how are we going to be able to pay for these things? They could be priced very high, and even in cases where the cost is more modest, such treatments could be so promising that we'll want to make them widely distributed, creating a challenge not just because of the price, but because of the volume that needs to be absorbed right away. The second topic we're going to get to a little later in the panel discussion, but at the outset, I first want to focus on the initial topic, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute, Dr. Michael Burgess, who represents the 26th Texas District in Congress, which comprises the majority of Denton County, which is in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. As many of you know, the Energy and Commerce Committee, of which Dr. Burgess is a member, has been working on an initiative to develop legislation that would seek to accelerate the development of transformative medical treatments. And part of that legislative initiative includes efforts to find reforms to the drug regulatory process that can make drug development more efficient and hopefully lower cost. We are grateful for Dr. Burgess for coming here today to talk to us about these efforts that they're undertaking on the committee. And to frame the discussion, Dr. Mark McClellan, who previously led FDA before he went on to run CMS, is going to moderate a discussion with the Congressman before you turn it over to some of your questions. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Burgess and Dr. McClellan. Thanks a lot.
All right, good morning to all of you, and thanks for being here with us on what is pretty much a medical schedule, getting started at 8 a.m. I know it's not early for you, Dr. Burgess. I've had breakfast with you starting as early as 6:30 or so, but thank you all for coming out so early to talk about these important topics. And as Scott mentioned in his introduction, we'd like to begin with a focus on the 21st Century Cures Initiative, which Dr. Burgess has been a leading part of the leadership effort to move this legislation along. So, Dr. Burgess, maybe you could just start out by talking about what you see as the most important goals of this legislation and why you think it needs to move forward now.
Well, really the most important goals are to foster the innovation, foster the development, make sure it happens here in our country, and reduce the time that it takes to get it to the patient. And it's kind of propitious we're doing this event this morning. It's 2 years and 2 days after the president signed the Food and Drug Administration Reauthorization Act and Safety Act. When you look back to 3 summers ago, we were all consumed with the debt limit discussion, and shortly after that there was sequester and the super committee, and everyone bemoaned the fact that nothing could get done. And on top of that, we've got an FDA reauthorization that's pending. And oh my gosh, it's never happened during a presidential election year that the FDA reauthorization would have to come up. And no one thought it was possible that it could work. The committee slowly were getting stakeholders in to talk. Both sides participated. And so after many, many meetings and hours and roundtables, in May of 2012, the committee passed unanimously on a voice vote the FDA reauthorization bill. The user fee agreements were reauthorized. Remember, unlike the highway bill that we've got up before us today, where the highway bill runs out, we can say, well, the dog ate my homework and write an IOU. You can't do that. When industry is contributing those user fees, if the authorizing legislation expires, as it would have September 30th of 2012, no one is going to step up and say, well, I'll just continue as you previously were receiving these monies with no control and no idea what I'm spending the money for. No one's going to do that. So it really was critical that we meet that September 1st, 2012 deadline. Senate did their bill, went through a conference committee, regular order, came back, passed the House floor, passed the Senate. The president signed it, There wasn't a photo op, there wasn't a lot of press because it was a presidential election year. He didn't want to be seen with us, we didn't want to be seen with him, but the law got signed and the user fee agreements went forward. Using that template, I actually applied that to the sustainable growth rate. You and I have some history with the SGR. Between Christmas and New Year's of 2005, when the SGR was expiring, Dr. McClellan put my cell phone number on call block because I was bothering him so much about it.
Lots of good conversations then.
It has been my mission to repeal the sustainable growth rate formula, the way that which physicians are paid. It's very pernicious and it undermines the whole system of healthcare and the Medicare system. We actually followed that same FDA template. We offered to the Democrats, we're going to repeal the SGR. Would you like to be with us? They said, we don't trust you, but we might observe. So they were observing, and then they said, maybe we should do a white paper. We said, we're done doing white papers. We're writing legislation. They stayed in the room. They continued to contribute. And really, it was about a year ago right now that our health subcommittee and then full committee on energy and commerce passed a full repeal of the SGR. 51-0, no dissenting votes. Henry Waxman was my co-sponsor. Probably the last time that will ever happen. But it worked. And then, of course, Ways and Means and Senate Finance did their work. At the end of the year, we kind of ran out of time. With a brief extension into March of this year, by February 6th, the big three committees had all accepted the policy. The chairman and ranking member of Senate Finance, Ways and Means, Energy and Commerce all agreed to the policy for repealing the SGR. That had never happened before. Now, we're still kind of bound up in some of the pay-for aspects. Yes, we're in another election year. It all makes things very, very difficult. But we're closer than we've ever been. And the reason is because the process was open. The process was not secretive. The process did involve both sides of the dais. But we also opened it up to you. We opened it up to medical specialty societies. We opened it up to patient groups, provided an email address. If you got ideas on the SGR, we want to hear from you. And in fact, I'd get feedback from some doctor groups. I can't believe that you actually read what I sent to you, and I know that you did because you plagiarized all of it in legislative language. And I said, no, we don't plagiarize in Congress. That's a derivative. But clearly, there was that back and forth and that interaction, and it was important. This morning on the Cures Initiative, yes, we've had, in fact, the email address, if anyone is interested, is cures@mail.house.gov. So people who are watching these roundtables that are on C-SPAN, if people have ideas, we do want to hear from you. This morning will be a patient panel because it's very important. It doesn't do any good to have the cures if the patients haven't been involved in the process. So they'll be involved this morning as well. This year will be a listening year only from you, from industry, from academics, from certainly from governors, certainly from the investing class. All of the pieces are important. And I'll tell you, I'm relieved that we're doing this because it seemed like last year or the year before, there wasn't a week or a month that went by that there wasn't someone in my office with a tale of woe about how difficult the regulatory process was, how unpredictable it was, how the goalposts always moved. Part of the FDA reauthorization was to deal with some of that, but now moving on, how do you get over that hump? 500 cures with 7,000 diseases. We clearly need to do better.
Well, clearly a lot going on. In fact, one reason we had to start so early this morning is you need to get to that next roundtable. And these have been going on in the committee just about weekly, or more than weekly. You're getting a lot of input on a lot of different issues. What do you see as the most important topics emerging from all of these? You've talked about digital health. You've talked about the President's Commission on Science and Technology report about drug development reform. You talked about modernizing clinical trials, patient perspectives today, next week, barriers to communication about drugs and devices coming up, all very important topics. Is the legislation really going to cover this whole spectrum?
That is an open question. What will the legislation look like? Congress has a 7% approval rating, so anything we do that's comprehensive, it scares people, and with good reason. It should. when the FDA bill came through, it was actually a series of about 10 or 12 bills that were introduced by individual members, had hearings on those bills, and then they were eventually condensed into one bill. I suspect that will be the process that will be followed, but it is also quite possible that each of the areas where attention is needed may be important enough in their own right to require legislation. Now, one of the things that just really concerns me, and we do hear this theme over and over again, is because of the unpredictability of the regulatory environment in this country, people are going elsewhere for their development. And if they go elsewhere for their development, likely that host country is going to be very interested in them having the laboratory or the factory or the manufacturing in that host country, in which case we lose the economic benefit from having that discovery, even though it may well have been an American mind that came up, or an American academic institution that came up with it in the first place. So keeping the ability to do all the way through the development phase and discovery phase, and then getting it to market, all of that happening within our shores. And our regulatory system should be able to handle that. And that was part of the FDA bill, but where we haven't gone far enough, where there are still obstacles, that's what we're needing to find out. That's what we're needing to hear.
What's your take on some of the provisions in that bipartisan FDA bill of 2012 that were intended to address some of these issues? For example, the breakthrough therapy designation was specifically designed to help move through not just the regulatory process at the end, but the whole development process more quickly to get truly effective cures out to patients faster.
Well, I think we've already seen some benefits from that. And of course, the feedback does not stop when the bill gets signed by the president. So the interactive nature that was set up when the FDA bill was written, that process needs to continue. We will continue to have oversight hearings on the FDA to make sure that compliance with the legislation, the statute as it was signed, to be sure that there's a follow through there. We got a little bit of the sequester was problematic. It shouldn't have been. Obviously, these are monies that are contributed or paid by private industry. They're not government monies to begin with, so it never made sense to me that the government should be able to include that in the sequester. I think with this year's agricultural appropriations bill, which at some point will be finished, it's sort of in process right now, but I think we've gotten over that. But that was a really unfortunate obstacle that occurred. Okay, we're starting with this new trajectory, and we want this new degree of accountability and metrics from the FDA. Of course, their comeback to us was, well, we got hit with the sequester, so we can't possibly comply. I think that barrier is now removed.
That's interesting to hear. And I guess looking forward, as you're going into some of these next steps for further improvements in the regulatory process, further improvements in the development process involving FDA, do you see a need for more resources for the agency? They have a lot of responsibilities with a limited budget.
Well, the budget and resource allocations and discussions, that's just going to be part and parcel, not for this Congress, but for the next Congress and the next Congress and the next Congress. That's not going away anytime soon. Sure, we have an obligation, being the authorizing committee, to ensure that the funds requested by the FDA are reasonable, but to the point that they are reasonable, that they be provided. We're the ones then to have to make the case to the appropriators that those checks then get written. But it's going to be a tough budgetary environment, and that's not going to go away anytime soon. So my charge to whether it be the FDA or NIH or the CDC is you've got to make sure you're doing the best job possible with the dollars that you get. And everybody always starts out their testimony when one of these agencies will come before our committee, we're really going to need more money. Well, of course you are, but in the meantime, what are you doing with the dollars that you've got, and are you managing those effectively? And that really is for the people who are the heads of those agencies, and mind you, they're all accomplished individuals in their own right, but their managerial capabilities to manage the dollars that they do have And to the extent where we sometimes steal from agencies, we've got to stop that too. Or if agencies steal from each other, that needs to end too. The HHS tap on the NIH budget, nearly 2%. Well, NIH can probably do more with that money than HHS, so I would say leave it alone. But yeah, there will be discussions about funding levels. These are not going to be easy discussions, but they will be part and parcel of what happens going forward.
Getting the most bang for the buck. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the particular areas where the committee is exploring further steps on improving the innovation process. Some of these have to do not just with the usual user fee topics of giving the FDA some resources in return for tracking how long it takes to process an application and act on it, because actually that review process is only a small part of the development process. I mean, there's a whole long set of steps before then, and getting a drug into testing in people, and then getting through the different phases of clinical trials, and doing that in as straightforward of a way as possible that is actually accounts for most of the length of the drug development process, and similar issues for devices. So some of the areas of focus for the committee has obviously been on how do you shorten that? Can you use biomarkers? There are innovative approaches to trial designs. Are there other recommendations that could be taken from the PCAST report? Do you see that as a focus here that maybe is distinctive from some of the emphasis in the user fee legislation?
It is distinct. I think we've had 2 hearings on just that aspect. And, I grew up in the area of randomized clinical trials were the gold standard, and anything that you wanted to prove had to come through that method. But we do live in a different age, and everyone has an iPhone, and every patient can be an active participant and an instant responder. So there are different ways, or perhaps newer ways, of collecting data that do need to be explored, and some will need to be incorporated, because the concept of delivering things faster will, where the money is in that is in the phase 3 clinical trials, which takes so long. And is there a way to condense that time frame, still maintaining the vigilance, still maintaining the patient safety, and ultimately protecting the patient from things that should not come to market? Are there ways to reassess some of the things that don't make it through that process, that perhaps there may be other utility that where they could be used if a study was redesigned? So that's another aspect of it. Sunk costs are sunk costs. We all get that from a business perspective, but is it possible to come back and rescue some of those therapies that didn't make it through the first time for other applications? And I know that's one of the areas where Dr. Collins at NIH has focused, repurposing some molecules that didn't pan out the first time around. Yeah, that is a way to achieve some cost savings where you don't have to go back to square one. But there may be reasonable ways to rethink the clinical trial process. And I think we all know that when something goes through a randomized clinical trial, you're still going through a relatively small universe of people, and there is an enormous amount of data. In fact, from the 2007 reauthorization, and we talked about how to manage the amount of data that's out there that never gets sent back. Well, in 2007, everybody didn't have an iPhone, and now they do. So there is that ability for using social interaction at EC Cures. It was the Twitter handle for the Energy and Commerce Cures Twitter feed. There is that ability for that almost instantaneous communication.
Interesting. And another area that's getting more attention in recent years is what happens after drugs are on the market. So in 2007, you established the Sentinel initiative at the FDA, which is a post-market active surveillance system that's made possible by the growing amount of electronic data on the actual use of drugs and other medical products in practice. And in the 2012 legislation, there's a similar concept developed for medical devices. And I think behind these trends are 2 things. One is that especially for devices, but for drugs as well. There's a lot that can't be studied easily in the pre-market setting, and a lot that is learned as people get better with using these medical products when they're in actual use in specific clinical settings with specific types of patients and problems. However, a lot of the emphasis in the user fees has still remained on the pre-market side. That's where the vast majority of the user fee funding goes, and probably not coincidentally, that's where a lot of the focus on regulatory process and requirements and so forth has been. Do you see this trend continuing? And there's some ideas out there for not just breakthrough approval and accelerated approval with more collection on data and learning about treatments more accurately and completely in the post-market setting, but also ideas like staged approval or a pathway where there'd be limited use for some patients earlier where the drug's clearly effective, and then more use maybe in sort of similar genomic indications for different kinds of cancers or other types of applications for antibiotics once the drug's on the market, and similar emphasis on learning more about devices after they get to market. Is that part of that potential for learning a lot more from big data and actual clinical practice? Is that part of this effort?
Correct, and of course that's always been the promise of personalized medicine, that one drug or device applied broadly to the population may seem to be of limited utility, but if you can subselect the population, and now that is becoming increasingly possible, the degree of utility may significantly increase. And then I want to be careful what I say, because I am mindful that I'm sitting next to a former FDA administrator, but one of the things we have learned at the roundtables is, I don't know, you're probably aware of this, the information system or the information technology, the computer architecture available at the FDA sometimes is not up to the task of keeping up with many of these multiple studies and multiple data streams coming in. So that clearly is something that needs to be improved as well. If we're going to, it's one thing to have people pinging you with data, but if it's an older system back at the shop that's not able to handle that, it's not going to do anyone any good. So at some point, and we're probably past that point, this obviously needs to be looked at. I didn't hear this complaint from the FDA. This was a complaint coming from outside. There was a recurring theme. The information systems at the FDA were going to have to come up to date.
Sounds like another important priority. Well, you mentioned that for this range of issues, now is a period where the committee is doing some really in-depth review, listening to all stakeholders, listening to a wide range of ideas. You're trying to solicit some of the best ideas, and new ideas are coming in from all kinds of places to help improve the innovation process. And you said that you didn't expect legislation this year. Do you expect it next year? What's the timetable?
Now, this year's the listening year, the information gathering year. Next year will be the legislating year. If I'm fortunate enough to be returned in November, I look forward to participating in that. It's tough. You get into this, you get into this phase, this part of an election year, and things do slow down. I've been impressed that the committee has kept this going and kept after this, but really to expect the time during which true bipartisan cooperation can continue, those days may be finite. But it doesn't mean that they won't reestablish next year. I pointed out that it was a year ago this month that Democrats and Republicans on the committee came together and did the first SGR repeal, first significant SGR repeal that had been passed by the committee in anyone's lifetime. So there are opportunities. The political calendar will play a role. I can't speak for the chairman, but I think the recognition that it would be better to gather the information this year, and then in the early part of the next term, that's when get the shoulder behind putting the legislation together and pushing it.
And you really seem to be putting a lot of effort into getting that information in now before we get too close to the election and people get busy with other things.
Right, and of course at the staff level, they don't, their worlds don't quite revolve around the political calendar like the members do. So it is still possible to continue to assimilate data and go through data. So those portals of entry that people have through the Energy and Commerce website, through the Twitter feed, through the email address, all of those are available and will continue to work, and information will be appropriately collated on the other side. Maybe hearings this year, maybe hearings next year, but they all can be part of the mix.
All right, for at least 10 years, we haven't had a conversation where we didn't talk at length about the SGR, so we do need to want to turn to that a bit. You talked about the legislative timetable for the Cures legislation. For the SGR, the one-year patch that was passed in the spring could technically run through next March. As you mentioned, there's bipartisan agreement thanks to the process that your committee started on the content of what SGR legislation would look like. There is not bipartisan agreement on what the content of the pay-fors or the financing mechanism would be, and that ended up being a challenge last March. What do you see happening there? Is there going to be action during the sometime before the election? Is there going to be action during the lame duck session? Is this something that's going to be left to you after that successful re-election to deal with in January and February?
Well, I'm always optimistic, and there's still time on the clock. So could something happen prior to Election Day? Absolutely. I mean, if I'm a senator running for re-election and it's a tight race, I'd like to be able to show utility, and maybe this is something that I can convince enough senators that they ought to talk to their leader, their majority leader, about allowing to come to the floor. The process really had a lot of momentum. Again, everyone had signed off on it by February 6th. The current patch then lasted until March 31st of this year. That's plenty of time. That's 6 weeks. We've got the hard part. We've got the policy. We've got to figure out the pay-fors. Historically, how this, the House passed one with a pay-for that was very amenable for the House. Take the money out of the individual mandate in the Affordable Care Act. My opinion, the Affordable Care Act, the missing link of the Affordable Care Act was you didn't fix the SGR. So I'm just fixing a problem they should have dealt with in the first place. They didn't see it that way. But it did pass on the House. Every Republican in the House of Representatives has now voted for the SGR repeal, has voted for the policy. So that's important. That's something I can go back to and remind people when the pay-for may make things a little bit harder. We picked up 24 Democrats, even with that fairly partisan pay-for. Senator Wyden, who was the new chair, or is the new chair of the Senate Finance Committee, did not have a vote in his committee. I wish he had. He wanted to pay for it a different way. He wanted to use the overseas contingency operation funds. Whatever, do it, and then we'll go to conference and we'll dust off the rough edges. I think we all understand that at some point it's not going to be a single financing mechanism, whether it be ACA or OCO. It is going to involve cuts for providers, doctors, hospitals, beneficiaries, patients. All of that is going to be put together. Some of it may look very painful, but that's why it requires a bipartisan process. In my opinion, it's almost easier to do this in a divided government. So if we don't get it done by Election Day, is there a brief window of opportunity after Election Day? Sure, there is. And I just remind people, a very contentious bill in 2010, when there was a change in the majority in the lame duck session, the 9/11 responders bill came to the floor and passed after years and years of languishing. So there is a template to be followed there as well. So I remain optimistic. I think it can happen. If it doesn't happen this year, I'm prepared to introduce the legislation first week of January of next year. We've got 3 months till the patch expires, but there's no reason in the world. And this is what I was assured by my leadership. There's no reason in the world that we can't move forward with the final fix to this, even though we still have time on the clock for the patch. But obviously, the patch becomes more significant if we get into the first of next year.
Dr. Burgess, I'm sure you'll be at this till it's done. I'd like to open up this discussion now to those of you who are here. I think we have a few microphones in the room, yeah? Okay, so questions, comments, please raise hands and wait for a microphone to get there. Item.
Hi, Jim Glassman from AEI. You mentioned, Congressman, the Cures legislation. So I'm not an expert, and I think there may be people in this room who don't really completely understand this issue, but as I understand it, we now have drugs coming on that actually cure diseases. And we have a private health insurance system that seems more interested in paying for, knows how to pay for chronic diseases, like paying for antiretrovirals, $10,000 or $20,000 a year forever, rather than for a cure, which may cost a lot more, but it's done. Do you think that there's a role for government in figuring out how to kind of square that circle and get the private insurers to maybe develop a different kind of system to handle cures?
The short answer to your question is yes, there is a role. Would it be better if the payors and the developers work that out outside of the government? It might be, but if you ask us to figure it out for you, we will. You may not like what we figure out. You may be able to apply a greater knowledge set to that than the people who work on the committees. And I'm not saying that to be glib. The discussion comes up about the new hepatitis C drug, and instead of, we should be standing on our chairs cheering because cured hepatitis C. That's incredible. Here is a disease that when I was in residency at Parkland Hospital, we didn't even know what it was. We called it non-A, non-B hepatitis. The virus had not been identified. And now, I was going to say 20 years later, more 30, or okay, 40 years later, we've got a cure. Now, the cost, yeah, it's a problem, and from the payer side, it's going to have to be figured out. But really, the great big headline ought to be, we cured hepatitis C. In many ways, the scourge of the baby boomers. This was something that affected us more so than any other part of the population. I've always been concerned that there doesn't seem to be the type of communication, and again, I want to be careful because I am mindful I'm sitting next to a former FDA administrator, but there never seems to be the kind of communication I would like to see between the NIH, the FDA, and CMS, because here you've got the developer, here you've got the regulator, and here you've got, in CMS's case, for Medicare, the payer. What is the conversation? What is the two-way street here? NIH talking to FDA about, we've really got this new class of stuff that's coming. You had better be ready for the approval or the regulatory side of this to handle what we're fixing to give you. And similarly, CMS needs to hear that there is something coming that you may need to adjust some of the things and how you pay for things. So I really am anxious to see, as part of even the Cures Initiative, it's one of the things that I constantly am vigilant about. Are we talking to each other within the various federal agencies? And is there give and take? There may need to be a novel payment system for something, as you articulated. There may need to be a different way to do that. But at the same time, if you leave it to us, we'll figure something out. But it could be something as devastating as we'll just tell you what you can charge, in which case the possibility of recouping the development side of the equation is going to be much harder. Or we'll simply make it so that the price point can be such that it's above the reach of the population that desperately needs the medication, and then we'll let the marketplace figure it out. But the government will do it. I encourage you to do it first.
All right, we'll obviously get back to those topics in the next session. Hopefully some clearer ideas coming out of that for what the private sector and maybe the government can do. Other questions? I think we have time for one more. Maybe. Dr. Burgess,
It's
I know
too
you
early.
I know you have to head out to go to the next hearing. Anything we should be looking for from the committee in the near term on this or other important issues?
Well, I would encourage people to put the Energy and Commerce Cures website, as we know, when you peruse whatever websites you normally peruse, to to come and glance at that from time to time, do use the email address, cures@mail.house.gov, for ideas that you have. And just checking the Facebook page this morning, I noticed there had been a lot of activity on some things, so that's useful. Do bear in mind that although members of Congress may be on congressional recesses or fighting for reelection, the committee works day and night, so no problem. No matter how small, no matter what hour, they're always there to respond to the information that you provide them. And they won't be like Dr. McClellan and put you on call block.
I know where that comes from. Actually, I will say that your committee staff is working hard. Got an email from them after 11 o'clock last night, and they're up this morning getting ready for the hearing. So the committee obviously really does want your input. Now, this is a major process that's being undertaken with the Cures Initiative. It is likely to end up accelerating some of the steps that we're already seeing towards more personalized, highly effective, targeted therapies that hold the promise of curing or transforming a number of diseases. And as you've heard, that does raise some new policy issues. So we're going to talk about those after the break. This is going to be about a 10-minute break before we reconvene in here. Right now, though, I'd like to thank Dr. Burgess for his leadership, and you're definitely not on call block with me. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Mark.
we lose Greg Alton? Dave. So I want to get started. I appreciate everyone staying for the second session. There was a story in the Journal of the American Medical Association a couple of weeks ago, an article about a potential cure for sickle cell disease using bone marrow transplants. Now, the procedure itself is grueling. It's certainly not going to be for everyone. It was reserved for older patients in the trial. But it raises some tantalizing possibilities. And behind that, there's other methods to potentially outright cure sickle disease using gene therapy that look very promising. And some of these same approaches are in mid-stages of clinical development, being targeted towards metabolic diseases, inherited inborn errors of metabolism like Gaucher's disease, and even HIV using gene therapy types of approaches. Since many of these treatments could be delivered with perhaps a very short course of therapy or even a single infusion, the products themselves could be priced very high. All of the R&D costs and the incentives needed to recoup the investments that's been made need to be paid right up front. And in many cases, the cost of goods for these kinds of treatments, these platforms themselves, things like gene therapy, is not going to be trivial. So we could be dealing with some very high-cost products. For example, there's a product that's in development that would cure an inborn error of metabolism that currently is treated with a therapy that costs many hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. But the price could be well over $1 million for a single infusion of a gene therapy approach that could cure a disease that's exceedingly expensive to treat, not to mention all the public health ramifications for those who have it, but a very high expense. And since the promise of such therapy is so great, people are going to want to widely adopt these things when they come to market. So even in cases where the prices might be more modest, the cumulative cost could be quite high. So the question we want to grapple with is, are there new payment arrangements that can help payers spread out these costs so they aren't all absorbed right up front in a huge lump sum, but they can be amortized over some period of time during which both the public health and economic benefits of the new treatments accrue? I put out a paper today with Tanisha Carino of Avalere talking about some of these potential methods. Could you adopt relationships between drug companies and payers where, for example, the manufacturers would offer financing terms that would allow payers to amortize these costs, and under changes to GAAP accounting rules, they wouldn't have to recognize all the costs up front. Perhaps the product developer would be able to book the revenue all up front, or they would have to book the revenue over time. But if you look at other spheres of economic life where there's a high outlay for a capital product that's going to have benefits over a period of time, those outlays get financed. Those outlays get amortized. General Electric doesn't sell aircraft engines without selling financing terms to go along with this. These are the things we're going to need to think about, and these are the things we want to think about on this panel, because this is a largely new challenge. We've never had so many promising therapies in development that had the potential not just to temporize illness, but to actually permanently reverse or cure the underlying mechanisms of disease. So with us today to discuss these challenges and the opportunities is a good group. I'll briefly introduce them, and then I want to pose a question to each of them and allow them to offer some introductory remarks, and then we'll get into a more fluid Q&A. Dan Mendelson, who heads up Avalere, was previously a senior health official in the Office of Management and Budget and has worked extensively in the payer community. He was on the board of Coventry in addition to work he's done with manufacturers. We have Greg Alton, the Executive Vice President for Corporate and Medical Affairs at Gilead. Dirk Calcone, the physician and Managing Director of the Boston Consulting Group, and Dr. Mark McClellan, who needs no introduction and was previously introduced anyway. So I want to start off with a question to Greg, sort of the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and it came up before. Greg, we've asked you to join us here today, obviously, because some of the criticism you faced recently. Gilead has recently launched a new product, Sovaldi, that cures hepatitis C, but there's been a lot of controversy, particularly here in Washington, around the price. But not just the price, also the total cost, because the utilization has been so high. Can you explain how Gilead went about thinking about how it priced it and what you've done in response to some of this criticism? And also, did you expect it, or has it surprised you?
Well, thank you, Scott, and thank you, everybody, for coming here this morning. So in terms of how we price the product, you're not the first person to ask that question. We get that a lot. And we really start out by looking at the value. We really look at Sovaldi as a major breakthrough, major innovative breakthrough that cures a very devastating disease, hepatitis C, which results in, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it results in cirrhosis, it can result in liver transplant and liver cancer for patients. The challenges of curing hepatitis C have been out there for a long time. It's something our industry has worked on. Prior to launching Sovaldi, the therapies for hepatitis C were very, very toxic and didn't work very well, to be honest. They would only work in about 50 to 70% of the patients who could tolerate the therapies or were eligible for the therapies. And that was only about 50% of the patient population. With Sovaldi, we're curing virtually all patients are eligible. We have the data to show that. We can cure cirrhotic patients. We have data in African Americans. We have data in co-infection. And because of the profile of the product, it's more tolerable, and so more patients are able to withstand the therapy. We can do this in about 12 weeks of therapy. So we've shortened the course of therapy quite a bit as well. And this is the first wave, and this is using a short course of interferon, which is the toxic component of the older therapies. We have another generation that will be coming out in October, which will be interferon and ribavirin free, and those are the two toxic components of the prior regimens. And we're also able now to cure over 90% of patients with this regimen, and with the new drug coming out in October, about 95% of all patients. So we look at that as significant value. Again, focus on this is curing patients. It's not lifetime therapy. So the other thing that we did when we priced it, we actually did look at what the cost of those prior regimens were. They were inferior, but they also actually had quite a relatively similar cost to what we have. So the older regimens, roughly, rough numbers, were about $100,000 per regimen. So that's a cost of the older regimens. And we priced ours roughly in line with that. We looked at a regimen cost. So again, I think if you look at the media, and a lot of the criticism has been focusing on a per pill basis, or what the course of therapy costs. We really need to look at a total regimen versus total regimen, and this is similar. So if you look at the old regimens, we're right in line with that. And then we took it another step further. We looked at what's the total cost of treatment. So if you take the old regimen, because of the side effects associated with it, you would actually have to add on a lot of additional costs. There's costs of managing the patients and the side effects that the patients would have, keeping them on the therapy so that after 2 or 3 months they wouldn't drop off. So a lot of burden on the system for that. And then there was also the managing medically the side effects. So there was use of Epogen. There were blood transfusions associated with the anemia of these older therapies. And there were some studies done out of Harvard's done some studies, as well as Mount Sinai. And there's other studies out there showing that if you actually look at the total treatment costs of these older regimens, you could actually almost double the cost of treatment because of those side effects. So, and then if you actually then include the lower cure rate, the cost per cure of the older regimens was roughly somewhere between $150,000 and $200,000. With a Sovaldi regimen, we're actually getting down to about $115,000 per cure. So it's actually on a per cure basis much less costly. Then finally, we actually looked at, and this actually goes into one of your questions, what we anticipated the patient flow, because we did want to have some sense of what the system could handle. And what's actually happening right now is not sort of what you've seen in the media. I think people are throwing out these numbers that there's 3 million patients that somehow are going to run through the door and demand treatment tomorrow. And that's not what's happening. And so we saw about 30,000 patients come through therapy in the first quarter. I can't tell you what the second quarter is because we have earnings coming up, but it's not these huge numbers that people threw out there. So we're seeing a more rational flow of patients coming through. To answer your question on the criticism, we knew that there would be criticism. We're a pharmaceutical company. We're used to it. I think that it's something the media likes to do, and certainly we didn't think that this would go without some criticism. The volume's probably louder than we thought. I think that I guess we underestimated the type of media campaign that the insurance industry would put on here, and that's a little bit surprising. And I'm also surprised a little bit the disconnect that I'm seeing in terms of the coverage. I think that there's some basic principles of finance that are involved here, a cure versus chronic therapy, and that's really not talked about here. What is the value of a cure versus what's the value of a lifelong therapy, and that hasn't really been there. And I think the other thing that I guess we didn't really factor in is how this might fit into a bigger picture motivation, which is really opening up some of the issues of price controls or Medicare Part D issues that are sort of a bigger picture, and using Sovaldi as a sort of a sound block for that, and we didn't really anticipate that.
I want to turn to Dan next. I know, Dan, you have some slides to offer a perspective, among other things, from how the payers are looking at this and what changes we could make in terms of payment structures to allow them to better absorb these things. But, Greg, just to follow up one quick question. How do you think the observation of what Gilead has gone through, and the rhetoric has been tough at times, how do you think it's going to impact the environment going forward in terms of what companies might or might not do different, and what you might or might not do different with the learnings that you've had?
Well, I think there's two answers to that. I think in terms of what we really do as a company, we are looking at developing products that really meet unmet patient needs, and we're going to continue doing that. And I hope the industry continues doing that. And I think people do want cures for diseases, so we will continue investing in that area, and we'll continue developing those products, and ideally bring out more cures of diseases, because we think cures offer a significant benefit over chronic therapy. I do think that in terms of how we manage the expectations of the market, how we manage our media, and how we manage our government relations, I think it will be different. I think that we have a lot of learnings here, and I think we do need to actually recognize that when we bring a cure forward, it does create a bit of a shock to the system that we need to anticipate and do a better job of the dialogue and some of the things we're going to be talking about today.
So moving on to shocks to the system, Dan, I want to turn to you. And I know you have some slides. You served on the Board of Coventry, as I mentioned, and work with a lot of payers, among other people in the healthcare community. Can you, among other things, in framing your remarks, just encapsulate some of the challenges you think they face in absorbing these things, and where there's not just potentially a high cost, but a high adoption rate very rapidly? And what kinds of mechanisms you think can be pursued to get to Mark's point, the question he asked Dr. Burgess, and the point I made, that might change how we structure payment terms?
Yeah. First of all, also thank you for inviting me, and I'm really going to pick up where Greg left off. I'd like to talk a little bit about why we are here having this discussion right now, because I do think it's very fundamental, and to kind of frame it up, to be thinking about the fact that the business model for health plans has really changed very dramatically over the last few years as a result of the Affordable Care Act and other kinds of health system change that have happened, just at the same time that the business model for pharmaceutical companies is changing, with more targeted therapy, higher cost of therapy on a kind of on a per pill basis. So these two things are changing at the same time, and I think starting to cause a lot of friction that really will need to be addressed through some of the benefit design and other delivery system changes that we're going to be talking about today. So I do have a couple of slides that I'd like to put up, although I can't see them from here. So
You got the BCG slides.
yeah, all I see are BCG slides. Very depressing for me, actually. It's okay. It's okay. I'm sorry? Oh, go through them. I got it. I am technically competent. Wow, that's a lot of slides he's going through there. All right. I only have 4 slides because I'm a relatively simple guy. All right, so here we are. First thing is that I'd like everyone to think about things from the perspective of a health plan that's fielding a benefit in the exchange. And what kind of benefit design do you need to field in order to succeed in that marketplace? And your goal is to reduce the premium that you are charging to the patient. And your goal is also not to select a lot of really sick people into your plan. And those are 2 very strong imperatives, and you need to be able to do that in order to make things work. So as a result, what you do, and all of the research that we have released publicly, and all of this is on our website, so there's a lot of background that goes into this, is there are 3 facets of these benefit designs that are standard. One is that there are very high deductible plans, with the average plans of people buying the silver plans at $2,500 deductible, the bronze plans at about a $5,000 deductible. So they're high deductible plans. Second, they are associated with very high cost sharing for drugs, particularly on tier 4. So you take all of your drugs for multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, Hep C now, really anything that costs a lot of money, and you put that on tier 4, and you expose the patient to a high percentage of the cost of that drug. And you're doing that not because you're cruel-hearted, but because the only way to make this work is to field a benefit design that does not invite patients who are relatively sick to flood your plan. And we saw the exact same thing with Medicare Part D, where in the first year of Medicare Part D, you could get a 3-tier design that would, if you had multiple sclerosis or rheumatoid arthritis, you could get a relatively low copay for the product that you needed. But over time, what happened was that those designs were completely squeezed out of the market, and everything standardized around a 4-tier design. And then the third thing that we see are narrow networks. So the oncologist that you had been going to is probably not in this network. We released a lot of data on this, and you look at Memorial Sloan Kettering, a lot of the premier cancer centers are not in these networks. And so those are the facets of the design. And the point that I'm making here is that this is a business response to the environment. It's not going to go away. And in fact, our every expectation is that this type of design will converge rapidly over into the commercial benefit, that it's moving over, and it's moving already. We're seeing that in survey work that we are doing on what small employers and medium-sized employers are buying this year, and they're very interested in a design that is more restrictive, less expensive, and ultimately shifts more cost to the patient. So that's just something that we need to keep in mind as we are moving forward, that the construct that the Congress created here in the Affordable Care Act, which, by the way, I think is getting very important insurance to a lot of very low-income people. So I'm not dissing on it, not completely at least, but it's very, very important from a insurance perspective. I have to say that I'm at AEI, but from a benefit design perspective, it is shifting the market and making a benefit design that is pushing a lot more cost onto the patient, particularly for very important therapies that they will need. At the same time, we have a delivery system which often does not reflect the financial incentives that we need to be giving. So think about Sovaldi and who is actually responsible for the cost of the therapy. So let's say we go into a accountable care organization, and Mark and his crew have been doing a lot of research around this. They might be responsible for the out-of-pocket cost of the drug, but they might be responsible for the cost of the downstream therapy, but not responsible for the out-of-pocket cost of the drug. So there's a lot of misalignment of incentives here. And then, it's also, I think, the case that because of the fact that people cycle through plans so rapidly, a health plan might be responsible for the immediate upfront cost of the drug, but not benefit from the downstream cost savings of fewer liver transplants, less liver cancer, and all of the complications that we know and that Greg spoke about so eloquently in the research, because there's huge complications. So, that's the world that we are living in, and I wanted to take a little bit of a step back so that we could understand a little bit where things are coming from. The last point I'll make about this is that from a quality perspective, we think about the incentives that we are giving health plans right now, and quality metrics right now are really not aligned directly with the kinds of things that we need to have plans responsible for. So cure on Hep C is not a quality metric right now. But there are a lot of administrative quality metrics, and this slide just shows that there's a lot more performance measures that are based on administrative and outcomes measures as opposed to cures. And that's something that, again, I think kind of requires a lot of work and also sets us up for possible solutions. Do you have 2 more minutes, or you gonna use the hook? Okay, 2 more minutes. I think that, and this is good discussion, and I'll just cue it up. What we really need to be talking about is how we set up a system where we are not discriminating against patients with serious illness. And non-discrimination is a clause in Medicare Part D. It's a clause in the Affordable Care Act. We say that we will not discriminate, but yet these benefit designs discriminate. they discriminate against patients who have serious chronic illness, in my opinion. And so it's something to think about and take a step back and say, okay, if we want insurance ultimately to be something that covers people when they're in need, how do we design that? And I will say that I believe that this is a shared imperative. It's not only a pharmaceutical industry imperative, it's a managed care imperative, because you can't have an insurance system that just imposes huge costs on people when they find that they have multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, Hep C, whatever, certain types of cancers and the like. And so these ideas are the solutions that we're researching at present, and that I know that Scott and Mark and others are researching as well, are really core to the future of healthcare in this country, because we are moving to a world where there's going to be more individual insurance, there's going to be more a selection by individuals of insurance products. So we have to set it up in such a way that we take out the illness, if you will, from that selection. So there are three categories of solutions here, and I'm not going to go into the details of all of them, because I think this is going to be a discussion that we're going to be having both on this panel and after, of course. But first are changes in the insurance construct, and this is better reinsurance, maybe even giving health plans an incentive to go out and find unhealthy patients. Changing the nature of risk adjustment. That's also, I believe, a really important shared imperative between the managed care industry and the pharmaceutical industry, and one that could perhaps start to bridge that gap. So that's what we call kind of skewed risk adjustment, redefining discrimination, I mentioned before, selective carve-outs of diseases. I mean, I think that one of the question that was asked about the role of government, I think, is really a very important one here. And from my perspective, government is already integrally involved in all of these different, so the reinsurance mechanism is a governmental decision and a governmental function that affects fundamentally whether a plan will try to seek or avoid a patient with Hep C. We have a number of financing structures that I think are really beautifully summarized in the piece that Scott and Tanisha released today. That's an excellent piece of work. If anyone hasn't seen it yet, definitely pull that up. So I'm not going to talk about the GE financing model or anything like that. And then finally, drug contracting, I think, can address some of these issues. And a couple of ideas there. The one thing that I do want to mention is that right now the Medicaid best price provision is serving as a massive impediment to creativity and progress in pharmaceutical pricing. And we see this in our work every single day, that you have pharma companies who want to contract on a population basis, and they want to contract in an innovative way, and they want to take risk for outcomes, but they can't do it because of that Medicaid best price provision. Because if they run afoul of Medicaid best price, and it's really just a technical, I mean, I know why it was put in, and I've been dealing with it from a policy perspective for so many years, but you would not believe how much innovation is being squelched as a result of that provision. Because if you run afoul of that provision, you're in really big trouble. And so it is something that I think really could be addressed to help move the ball forward and make it easier for pharmaceutical companies to do what we want them to, which is to take responsibility for the outcomes that are associated with patient care. So with that, I'll close.
Thanks a lot. I want to turn to, you teed up Dr. McClellan fairly well. Mark, you've been talking a lot about some of the transitions that are underway in healthcare delivery, particularly accountable care organizations where you've done a lot of work. How do those changes that are underway either facilitate or impede the ability to think of different financing mechanisms? And I would think that it would facilitate it, and I don't mean to sort of set you up in one direction, but for example, if a integrated delivery system that's taking capitated risk can finance some of the cost of the acquisition of an expensive technology, makes it easier for them to take that risk, and it might even allow them to disintermediate the insurer, although I think that's unlikely, but they could try.
let me pick up on some of the comments that Dan made, which I think go to the same topic of how do new approaches like the credit type financing that you've described in the paper fit in with other reforms that are taking place. And just a reminder, as Dan emphasized as well, that the whole point of insurance in the first place was to help people with high expected costs. Many of those treatments historically have been for chronic illnesses that require ongoing care, but definitely not all of them. And the point is to support costs that people incur now when they may have benefits over time. A longer and better life, something that I think is also a factor in these kind of curative treatments, are benefits for others. So less disease transmission. That's really only, I think, a limited issue with Hep C, with the IV drug user population. That's a subset of all of those who are infected now, but also lower healthcare costs down the road for others. So those are good reasons to support, both for the individual benefit and the social benefits, good reasons to support these kinds of innovations in care. But typically we've done that through insurance for the reasons that Dan mentions. These have been ways of pooling risk so that people, if they do get sick, or increasingly as we get to more predictive medicine, if they have the bad luck to have certain genes or certain other risk factors, they're going to get more support in dealing with the cure, in getting the treatments that they need to address those higher costs associated with disease. And in trying to balance both providing that help with minimizing the costs and promoting the efficiency in using these services, as Dan said, there have been a lot of responses in the insurance industry and now increasingly among healthcare providers that are, moving away from fee-for-service payments, which may have been good in an era when you were just treating illnesses after the fact and dealing with chronic health problems, but are less good when you're really trying to focus on how do you keep a population as healthy as possible, and how do you take advantage of all of the predictive medicine out there that can lead to not having costs or other complications in the future. So as Scott said, I think this is, that this kind of financing could potentially help with that transition, but there are a lot of other steps that are important there as well. So with respect to the credit version of payment itself, there are going to be some issues that come up with, like, who finances this loan? Is it something that is going to amount to a cost shift from the insurer to the patient? There's a lot of that going on now. Probably, Dan, some of the people who are in those high-tier plans are taking out some loans of their own to help finance some of those treatments. Can this be done in a way that helps address that challenge? And if not, if this is something that the insurance companies can handle directly anyway, could they actually, do they actually need help with this kind of long-term financing? Do they have better access to credit markets already? And then there are also some issues about shifting costs down the road. If they're incurred later, does that mean that future taxpayers are going to pay them? They do get the future taxpayers do get some benefits in terms of people being healthier, having fewer infectious diseases that will affect their downstream costs, but we're already loading a lot of future healthcare costs on future Americans because of the pay-as-you-go nature of our entitlement programs in this country. So I think this is a very important problems, but some important challenges to consider in addressing them. And just I want to leave plenty of time for discussion, but I did want to highlight that maybe a good place to start here is, as Dr. Burgess suggested, it is there a particular drug manufacturer, say Gilead, is there a particular health plan out there that has kind of a longer term focus, maybe a population health focus, maybe an integrated plan like Kaiser or something like that, that might want to try an approach like this first that could give a model of how this might work out before we get involved in a lot of the legislative and other steps. And then finally, would highlight, as Dan did, that there's some other policy reforms out there that could either reinforce this kind of step or provide some of the same kinds of benefits. Dan mentioned risk adjustment and reinsurance payments. Those are certainly works in progress, but they've been a critical part of Medicare Part D, getting it to function as well as it has, and how, for example, if there was a different risk tier set up for patients who have hepatitis C and maybe down the road patients who have certain genomic characteristics that make them at risk for needing more expensive treatments, that's a way of providing that same kind of support that we wanted insurance for in the past. It's not just accidents and unexpected acute health events now, though. It's differences in genes, differences in risk that are much more predictable than they used to be, and you can't deal with that in a traditional insurance kind of framework. There may also be ways of sharing some of these benefits with patients. So if a patient does incur some of these high costs up front to go from being an untreated hepatitis C patient at risk of significant further medical expenses and potentially transmitting the disease to others, well, maybe they should share in those savings as well. That's something that's very difficult to do under the current ACA structure, but there are steps that people can take that will reduce their future health costs and health risks, and using a curative treatment like this is one of them, and maybe there's a way to build in those incentives as well. So I think there are a lot of steps beyond just focusing on the credit payment that need to go along with this shift that we're seeing from treatments that are broad-based and work a fraction of the time and need to be taken for a very long time towards treatments that are much more targeted, much more effective, and therefore much more high value.
Thanks. I want to turn to Dirk, but before I do, I just want to turn back to Greg for a quick question. The issue of Medicaid best prices come up a few times as an impediment to creativity around different kinds of payment schemes, and I agree with the criticism of the Medicaid best price rules. So, Greg, I want to ask you, how big of an impediment is that? What can you tell us about how big of an impediment is that, and what are the other impediments, quite frankly, that you would have to doing something creative?
So, first, I want to start off by saying that if the impediment wasn't there, I'm not going to say what we would or would not do in terms of, because I'm not in that position. But the answer is yes. I mean, it would be an impediment if we wanted to be more creative. The best price would be an issue, and I'll just give you an example. I was actually at a meeting with one of a very large HMO who will go unnamed right now, and the person on the other side of the table from me actually said himself. He said, we get it, that we could not actually really engage in a really creative type of arrangement with you because of the best price issue. So that was actually coming from a large HMO who actually said that up front. That being said, we have to work within the system that we are in, and this is what we have to do. So we have our wholesale acquisition costs, $84,000, and then we have limitations on what we can do to discount off of that. But we do discount, so we are discounting into large HMOs to the best of our ability, and we think a fair way. On Medicaid, we have the mandatory discount on Medicaid, which everyone knows is 23%, but we offer discounts beyond that 23%, so we can do that. So as we go to the states, we actually work with them and provide additional discounts. And then for the FSS, as some of you may know, this is largely benefiting the VA, which is a very large hepatitis C population and also a very needy population in the United States. We actually are able to provide substantial discounts to the VA. It's actually a 41% discount to the FSS. That's the VA corrections, federal corrections, Indian Health Services. But if we didn't have the best price issue, we absolutely would provide an ability to do more creative structures with private payers.
I'd also just add, if I could, that in the Gilead situation with novel therapy launch, no competition, it's very different from what it'll look like 2-3 years from now when there are going to be other therapies in and they're going to be competing with one another. So the places where we see best prices being the biggest impediment is when there is actual competition between different agents. And so you have, more of an interest on the part of the pharmaceutical companies in actually getting really creative about trying to attract business than in a situation where there's a novel therapy which is best, first, and unique in class, which is really very different. He can't say that, but I can.
But there's even an issue here. There's even an issue here for cases where there's not competition. If you did want to have, again, I'm not speaking for Gilead, but if you did want to have a payment contract that was tied to something like, actually achieving a sustained viral response, actually achieving a cure, something that could be tracked over time and tied into the payment, it's very complicated to do that, and to shift some of those savings back to the healthcare providers under the current anti-kickback rules and the Medicaid best price.
Right. I mean, some of the interesting thinking we're seeing around Sovaldi right now from the health plan side is that, with the cost of therapy, you want to make sure that people are actually taking their pills. One of them drops on the floor and the dog eats it, that's $1,000, And so you have to make sure that the course of therapy is actually completed and that it gets through. And so we're seeing health plans starting to kind of come in and design programs around that with respect to compliance, and that's something, again, that could be a shared function.
I want to pull Dirk into this. I know you've done a lot of work about hepatitis C. I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about how it encapsulates some of these challenges, how it's different, and frankly, what would you envision in terms of opportunities for different kinds of payment arrangements going forward? And then after this, I want to open it up to the audience, see if there are questions from you all. We turned the temperature up, so hopefully there'll be questions now.
So I'm not a politician, but instead of answering the question, I will actually go back to some data that's pretty important to show and to kind of put a framework around this whole discussion. So I'll actually stand up and go by the slides. I used to be opera singer, so I think my voice will carry in the room. I'm also Belgian, so my apologies and my condolences for those who follow soccer. Don't blame me. But it's probably two questions. One is, what does it take to develop cures? And then the next one is, how do you actually pay for cures? Just probably a reminder for all of us that drug development is very risky. It's also a lengthy process. For those of you who can see the chart here, what we did was, and BCG is a consulting firm that really brings data to debate, so we want to show data that's objective and that has been based on publicly available information. What we see here is across a couple of diseases. I'm happy to take that. I probably don't need it. We need it. You need it? Okay. So in terms of drug development, what you see here is the industry average. It takes about 15 molecules early in development to get to one drug launch, and that's average across the industry. If you look at HCV, which is one of the topics that has been brought up in the debate, you need about double the molecules at the start of development. If you actually look at another disease which has a high burden and also high unmet need, Alzheimer's disease, you can tell by the difference that you need about 10 times the industry average. We also looked at some antibiotic diseases, given that some bacterial diseases, given that there is not a whole lot of development in antibiotics, with the exception of MRSA. In MRSA, you get about to the industry average. So it takes a long time. It's also very risky. And as you can see here on the left, hepatitis C, in the middle, Alzheimer's, and then MRSA. Just look at the red. These are all the compounds that have failed, but also look at the top. You see the number of projects that have actually been invested in by the private sector. So for Hep C, over the last 2 decades, there have been about 700 projects invested in, of which the majority have failed. For Alzheimer's, similar. For MRSA, similar. So the question is then, given that it takes such a long time, that it is so risky, what actually drives innovation? And what drives innovation is really people going after, companies going after
burden of disease, going after unmet need. Interestingly enough, the US prevalence of Hep C and Alzheimer's is actually relatively similar. I won't talk about the worldwide numbers. And so given that there is some incentive at the back end in terms of getting paid, people go after these diseases and provide drugs to the diseases that need it most. The other thing I would say, and I mentioned antibiotics already and bacterial diseases, when there's actually somewhat of a lack of incentive at the back end in terms of bacterial and antibiotics not being priced that high, being areas that have been ignored in the last couple of years. What you see here over the last couple of decades is actually a timeline with new classes of antibiotics having been brought to market. In the last 2 decades or so, we actually have seen a discovery void of bringing new classes to market. And the question is, why does that happen, and what does it lead to? First of all, there is a big unmet need. You see here, well, you probably don't see the numbers, but believe me, they are there. There's a huge unmet need in terms of antimicrobial resistance, and a topic of national security concern, a topic of global concern. And again, as I mentioned, in terms of MRSA, that's actually one of the areas where there has been quite a bit of development for that particular antibiotic against methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. And here you see that some of the price premiums that have been in place can actually create some advantages in terms of drug development. I'm a physician, and it's also good to think about, given that cure is actually a pretty difficult concept to grasp. I also wanted to briefly mention what we mean by cures. Most cures are actually, first of all, a cure is pretty exceptional. It's a pretty peculiar thing. It's actually pretty amazing to think of cures in medicine. The best known cures, I would say, are antibiotics. You have an antibiotic disease, you take an antibiotic. You have a bacterial disease, you take an antibiotic, you're cured of the bacteria. Other cures have been more based on preventative measures. We all know the history of smallpox eradication in 1976, based on vaccine use. We all know that there's a huge push now to eliminate and eradicate polio, but there is also other elimination programs. I want to come back to Hep C, because Hep C is very interesting and very peculiar, because we are really dealing with a chronic disease that now has a cure of a drug that you use for a short time. So it's really a chronic disease with an acute treatment based on a SVR, sustained viral response cure. Because that's really important context for this whole discussion in terms of paying for cures. The question is, why do you really want to pay for cures? Well, it's because you can avoid a lot of costs of treating the disease downstream. As I mentioned, we're in the business of analyzing data. What we did here was create a model of a European country and looked at what is the annual treatment cost and the cumulative cost over the coming 30, 40 years or so of having Hep C in the country without any treatment available. That's the curve here. If you then think about adding a drug treatment, you can actually reduce the treatment costs quite significantly by about $6 billion out of $9 billion. If you start treatment in 5 years, if you start treatment in the next year, then you can actually add another billion or so in avoided costs. So the question is, as some of the other panelists have referred to, the question is, how urgent is it to treat patients? How quickly do you want to treat patients in order to avoid those downstream costs? This is a simple slide, and it's actually an important one, and it really frames a lot of the debate around Hep C. It talks about one of the key challenges of paying for cures. What we are used to in society, as Scott mentioned in his introduction, is really diseases that get treated, especially chronic diseases that get treated, sometimes you get a cure, but often, like an HIV, which has a functional cure with the current treatments available, you really, have a continuing treatment leading to a continued cure. What we're dealing with here is actually an acute treatment and then a cure with long-stream benefits down the line. And the question is really, how do you pay for that acute treatment regimen, given that you actually have benefits over decades through the rest of the patient's life? The other key challenge is obviously that as people know that revenue equals price times volume, therefore also the impact of payer budgets equals price times volume. Price is really, given the previous slide, you should really think about it, and I think Greg referred to that, you should really think about price as price per cure. And then volume, very interestingly enough, we're dealing here in terms of Hep C, we could deal, if we had a cure for Alzheimer's, we're dealing with, huge populations, we're dealing with huge prevalence incidents. And so one of the key things that's driving the debate in the public is not just the price, but it's also the volume, and it's, when do you get the patients, when do you need to treat the patients, what are the most important patients to treat first, is there some kind of rationalization, prioritization that needs to happen? Last but not least, in terms of the payer approaches, we also did some analysis. This is actually analysis using US data, looking at the cost of inaction. So payers incur costs of paying for, say, Hep C treatment, but they also incur costs if Hep C is not treated. What we analyzed here over the next 20 years or so is actually the cost of inaction, meaning what will happen in terms of, this chart is for new liver diseases, what will happen if you actually don't treat Hep C, leading to X number of liver cancers. And what we see is that as you get improved treatments, as you get also increased coverage of treatments, you actually avoid a lot of costs by the payers in terms of dealing with liver cancers. As you move here on this curve down, you can actually see that as you improve the treatment regimens, you can actually go from saving 24,000 to 40,000 liver cancers as you treat the disease. This is part of a paper that we are publishing with the California Healthcare Institute, I think in a few weeks, so you'll see that in the public domain shortly. But I wanted to go through this because it really sets up the debate around what is really key here in terms of paying for a disease like hepatitis C, and maybe to help the audience and the panelists, I'll maybe leave this slide up because it really frames some of the key questions that we are dealing with. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I want to just turn to the audience, see if we have any questions from the group. There, people have mics. You have mics, or? You can shout.
Hi, thanks. Mike Miller. I'm a health policy physician and blogger. This is a great discussion to have because, as Dan talked about, the changes in the insurance industry and their payment model and the pharmaceutical, biopharma industry, and moving into more specialized medicines. But I've been looking into this issue for a couple of 3 months, and one thing that I think is really different about hepatitis C is that it's the first chronic viral disease biomedicine is cured, and there's nothing else in the pipeline for it. I mean, Scott, you mentioned gene therapy for sickle cell. I don't think that's right on the horizon either. That's pretty far off. So I know that Dirk has his model here about this is like a cure and this is versus chronic treatment. Hepatitis C is really not like any other disease we're dealing with now or in the near-term horizon. So I don't think it's a great model for how to think about all the other specialty drugs that are coming over the transom. Unless I'm missing something, there isn't those kind of new cures. And the other thing about hepatitis C is 20 years ago, they developed the screening test for blood tests because the primary transmission of hep C was through blood transfusions. So it's a reasonably finite population of people who need this treatment, this cure. It's not like Alzheimer's, where we've got an exploding elderly population with projections for increasing numbers or cancers or anything else. So can people comment on that aspects of hepatitis C versus other specialized drugs? Thank you.
I'll just say a brief comment up front. I don't think it's a perfect model for the challenge that we're talking about in a lot of respects, because frankly I think the pricing is much lower than what we're likely to see in the future when we talk about some of these gene therapy cures, where the cost of goods is going to be exorbitantly high, and you could see treatments priced at $1 million or more. And it also probably is higher prevalence than a lot of those potential cures. When we talk about some of these orphan diseases, if you can cure them, you're dealing with a defined population. This is a broader population. So I think the challenge here isn't necessarily one of price per se, but volume. In the future, I think it's going to be, the price is going to be more prominent, the volume is going to be small. So I think it's a little different in that regard. I think just how it is similar and how we talked about in the paper is it's a one-time expense. You're pulling forward all these future costs into the present to cure these people. And the folks who are paying for it aren't necessarily going to be the ones who recognize that economic benefit. And so in that regard, I think the construct is the one we're going to see. And I would challenge just the proposition that we're not going to see these things for a very long time. I mean, these things are in mid stages of development. I think we've been working on them for decades, and people are figuring out how to do this. And when someone gets this right, so there's a gene therapy program for sickle cell disease, there's a gene therapy program to try to reconstitute someone's T cells so they're resistant to HIV. When people figure this out, I think you could see it move through the regulatory process very quickly, because the proof of concept is going to be easy.
Yeah, I'd like to comment. So I hope you're wrong, because we're working on other cures for other diseases. And I just want to give one example. So HIV is a good example. We treat HIV chronically, and I think the chart that Dirk left up is actually really helpful to think about this. In HIV, we actually have a functional cure because we can suppress the virus to undetectable levels, but we can't cure it, and it's a lifelong therapy. Currently, the cost of the newer regimens for HIV is about $30,000 per year, every year for life, and that's ongoing. Obviously, when patents expire, that will change, but that's what we've been paying for the last 10, 15 years. If you were to net present value that cost, and again, this is coming back to basic finance, that cost was roughly $400,000, $500,000 if you were to say if we could cure those people instead. Clearly, people would rather be cured than have chronic therapy as well. Now, so let's just say that we develop a cure for HIV that came out tomorrow. What would the value of that be versus the chronic therapy that we're currently paying for? And if we were to come out with a price like we have on Sovaldi, perhaps we'd have the same criticism that we're having today in HIV. But I'd ask the question why. We're happy to pay, or not, maybe not happy, but we do pay, and there's not a lot of criticism around paying $30,000 a year chronic therapy for life. Why are we complaining about a cost of $100,000? It's the business model. I think it really comes back to the business model and the fact that we don't have insurance industries and other payers don't have the ability to actually think about upfront costs the same way that we think about buying a house or buying a jet engine.
Yeah, I would add also that the government makes decisions that are setting the rules of the road for all of this. And so when the exchanges are specified and there's really an incentive for a very skinny benefit design, that is a set of decisions that led to that conclusion. So, or put differently, why is there a Ryan White program, but there's no similar program for Hep C? And so the government is right now making decisions that will answer in a lot of ways this question about, how are cures financed in the future, both through the private sector, through the insurance construct, as well as through governmental constructs as well.
And that is going to have an impact on how likely it is that these treatments come along. I mean, if the financing regimen isn't there one way or another for treatments that may have high upfront costs, but also have very important health benefits, high level of confidence important downstream cost savings, then you're not going to see as many of them. That's why it's really important to get this right, even though we aren't seeing maybe a whole lot of these yet. I would highlight, though, that's all the more reason why we need a different kind of financing mechanism, one that can give people, give payers, others, the public more confidence that, if you use this treatment up front, you really are going to get the cure. And we talked about, Dan talked about some of the challenges of actually staying on the 12-week regimen. I think for most of the people who have Hep C today, one-time cure is going to do it, but there is that IV drug abusing population, which could be a recurrent challenge. And I think we just don't have great financing mechanisms in place now, because we have financing mechanisms that were designed for drugs, pills you take chronically, where Medicaid was supposed to get the best price.
Yeah, just to add to this, it is a very peculiar situation to your point, but I also agree with Greg that, hopefully we will have more cures in the future, and hopefully it will come with, the need to treat and then the ability to not have to treat later on, which is really what we are in now. The system is almost not used to this. It's a very odd, it's a very special circumstance where you really can, for an individual patient, eradicate the virus out of the body. And so, as you see in the chart, most of the diseases we are used to, apart from some of the bacterial diseases where you treat for 10 days, are diseases that are more chronic, where payers and the whole society is more used to a longer-term treatment. Had Sovaldi, the Gilead drug, been priced, had it been priced at, say, $10,000 over 8 months, I'm not sure if, there would have been a lot of discussion. Had it been priced at, $4,000 over X number of months, there probably wouldn't have been a debate. It's that concept of a one-time cost and then with a benefit that really stretches over a lifetime, so to speak, which also is quite different. And someone brought up the question around HMOs and how HMOs are thinking about it differently. If you also think about the situation in some European countries where you do have a single payer system, where then if you think about who incurs the costs and who carries the benefits in a single payer system, obviously, or not obviously, but in a single payer system, typically the payer who incurs the initial cost will then also benefit over a longer time. Whereas in a fragmented system, if the patient changes work, changes insurance carrier, it is a bit more, it's not a bit, but it's a lot more complicated in the US, given the fragmented healthcare system that we live in.
Since we are at AA, I'll just say the single-payer systems haven't been any more amenable than the fragmented systems of paying some of these costs. I want to turn to the back of the room.
Good morning, John Rother. I'm the CEO of the National Coalition on Healthcare, which is consumers, employers, and providers, as well as payers. And Scott, this panel raises a whole lot of questions. I'm tempted to try to respond to several, but I'll try to stick just to one. The issue of innovation is very important, that we structure a system that can encourage innovation. But of course, in this case, the innovator company was Pharmaset, which then was purchased by Gilead. And this morning, just a few minutes ago, Chairman Wyden and Chairman Grassley released the SEC filing from Pharmaset with regard to Sovaldi, in which the company said they plan to market the drug and make a profit at $36,000 for total treatment, not $86,000. So $36,000 is a lot more of a discount than anything that's been talked about here. And that took into account the risk of R&D, and it took into account other factors that have been discussed here. So I do think that the fundamental issue here is the price. And the other issues around financing and risk are secondary.
Sure. First of all, I just want to correct something that you said, which is that that Pharmaset did all. Well, I think you're inferring that we bought a ready-made product. At the time we acquired Pharmaset, The product was in early phase 2 development with no data on genotype 1, the primary genotype in the United States. We have done all the clinical trials from then on, including all the phase 3 trials, all 6 of them. So most of the actual risk taken on the product was done by Gilead, most of the investment in the product. I'd also like to comment on the price. I mean, you're throwing out one price perhaps that Pharmasset had in a document somewhere that I'm quite actually not familiar with. But to suggest that a cure for a disease like hepatitis C should be priced at $36,000, I think Mark made the comment, that would put a huge disincentive on investing in cures for our industry. It would actually make it much more lucrative for the investment community to invest in chronic therapy because you have a one-time cost of a cure. So I don't know if that's an accurate portrayal of what our industry thinks in terms of what's a fair price and what's value.
Hi, Brian Harvey. Comment and a question. I trained as a gastroenterologist and treated patients with Hep C. And actually, I think it's an excellent example because it's not just the folks who have gotten blood transfusions. I mean, they've been testing for hepatitis C now since the early 90s with the first generation antibody. And many of the patients that I saw in the 90s had no risk factors at all, middle class, housewives, a few had gone to Woodstock back in the 60s. But, you really, and where, I used to say, where were you in the summer of love? And then, I'd test for Hep C. But often you could not find any risk factor. So, I mean, I think it actually is quite good. And I think what we really need to do, and my question is, how do we change the dialogue? Because there's so much focus on the cost of the medicine and not the cost of the total healthcare system. There's a wonderful example of Lovenox, which is a low molecular weight heparin. And when it came out, it was 10 times more expensive than traditional heparin, and insurance companies didn't want to pay. And yet, if someone came to the emergency room and had a blood clot in their leg, in the old days, you'd be admitted to the hospital, you'd be there 5 days. Mark knows when he was a medical student up at Harvard, you'd admit them and you put them on Coumadin, and then after a 5 or 6 day admission, when their Coumadin levels got therapeutic, you send them home. With Lovenox, they get a shot in the ER, they go home. You don't have the admission. So you save so much more, but if you look at it from a drug side, X dollars versus the hospitalization and the total cost, depending on how you do your economic analysis, very different numbers. So it's almost as if the way, how do we change the dialogue? Because the way it's phrased, how can we pay for cures? It's, how can we create a healthcare system that values what you've done? Because, we could quibble over whether 3 months is a cure or not, but I think we all can agree that what you've done is not just an intervention, a minor improvement. It's been a quantum leap in treatment.
I would say that there are a number of things that can be done to facilitate better dialogue in this area, and that it really does require a lot of dialogue. I put up a slide before about 3 different categories of potential solutions to financing, and I think that's a really good place to start. I would note that a lot of those items are really areas where there needs to be dialogue with patients, health plans, and the life sciences industry brought together to have these discussions. And I think that dialogue is really important and increasingly difficult, frankly, in a world where the political dialogue is essentially shut down. If you have half the Congress who oppose the Affordable Care Act and don't want to talk about making it better, it makes it more difficult to have a discussion about how the benefit design can actually be improved. You can't really have that in a political context, so that I think it falls on everyone sitting in this room to make that dialogue happen and to bring together to say, well, how can we move from point A to point B? I think a lot of what we see in the healthcare environment right now, which I described in some detail in the beginning, isn't going away. And in fact, if you think about insurers starting to bring in programs where individuals can choose across different benefits, there's only going to be more of this kind of selection where patients have the ability to select kind of where they want to go, and plans will be in a risk-averse position to try to make sure that that they don't select their plan if they have a major illness. And so, I think that's part of it. I want to also just touch briefly on this question of like the really advanced cures and the kinds of things that are really coming down in genomics and some of the personalized medicine that's coming down the pike. I serve on a public company board of a little cancer company called Champions Oncology, where we take tumors from humans and implant them into colonies of immunocompromised mice, and then test 10 drugs on those mice to figure out which personal therapy is best for the patient. And it turns out, of course, that about in 80% of the time, the labeled drug is not most effective in shrinking the tumor in the mouse. And if you think about that, and the potential for that, it's very expensive therapy, and it can be purchased, CLIA test, it can be purchased by an individual. That's the kind of thing that insurance companies do not want to pay for, and will drive costs increasingly in the future. So there are so many examples of this in therapies that are available now and tests that are available now, in addition to some of the things that are coming down the pike that I think Greg described very nicely, that really are going to tax this construct that we've put in place and really require that we make some significant changes through consistent dialogue.
To add to that, I couldn't, maybe a little bit more optimistic take on the political situation here and the implications for innovation. I couldn't see Dan's chart of 3 from this side of the table, but I assume on there were things like moving more towards payment based on health outcome measures and towards adjustments like more sophisticated payments for patients in the exchanges, like in Part D, based on their risk. So things that would alter that dynamic of plans feeling like they need to select the healthy in order to make ends meet, as opposed to selecting, delivering the right treatments to improve the health of the patients as much as possible at the lowest cost. I do think a lot of progress on that is possible in the absence of legislation. CMS has the authority now to move much more in the direction of collecting and using outcome measures than they are today. Some of this is happening in some of the payment reforms, and many private plans are doing this too. So this is an area where I think there's a real opportunity for more collaboration between the product developers who are working on these new cures that are going to lead to measurably significant improvements in outcomes. Like SVR is a great measure. I mean, you can see it within 12 weeks. As long as somebody doesn't get reinfected, it's not going to go away. So it'd be a great basis for changing this dialogue a bit. And in terms of paying attention to things like risk adjustment and other programs that will alter the way that health plans view attracting patients who are potential beneficiaries of these new treatments. I mean, there are pathways there to make progress. And then finally, as Dr. Burgess mentioned earlier, the legislation that I think is perhaps most closely related to some of these steps, payment reforms for physicians in Medicare, and pathways to get better post-market data available on impacts on outcomes. Those are bipartisan areas. So I think there is some real progress possible here on these problems.
I think the ACA discussion could definitely be expedited, and I agree that there are a lot of areas where CMS can actually make decisions. Honestly, CMS has a fair amount of discretion over what these formularies look like in the exchanges. So that's a nice example, of yours. But certain changes in the reinsurance provisions, for example, probably would require congressional action. So it's just. I think the most important point is really up to us, and I think you'll agree with this, to structure that dialogue, come together, and also find areas of commonality where the different industries can stop fighting with each other and come up with some constructs that will really help patients. Because I think to this point, the dialogue's pretty shrill right now.
You seem to suggest that the insurance models are converging around the template that's becoming the predominant form in the ACA because it's going to be such a big part of the market. Just is it going to be hard to innovate outside of that construct? You're going to have a shrinking commercial market. What remains of it's going to converge around the structures in the ACA. So if companies actually look to innovate payment arrangements, they're going to go first to some kind of legislative process. Is that what I'm hearing, or?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I think what we are seeing in the market right now, based on survey that we've done as well as discussions with plans, is that when small to medium-sized insurers see the kinds of cost savings that they can get with a high deductible, narrow network, and high cost sharing on drugs, they're really interested in that kind of a product. Whether they will move to that and how rapidly is really the commercial question. And I would say that what most employers have been doing for the last decade is just slowly raising the portion that the consumer is facing through increases in premiums and increases in deductibles, but that's accelerating in this market. And so I think that, and then with private exchanges coming in and starting to take more of the market, there's more selection by the patient as to what benefit they might actually want to engage in. So I think it's more driven by a commercial trend than it is necessarily by government, but I think the government decisions and the structure of the Affordable Care Act and the benefit that resulted from that structure is driving the marketplace in ways that are very important.
Well, but just to add to this, I mean, narrower networks are not necessarily bad. I mean, you know, Geisinger or Intermountain, that's a narrow network in a sense. It's just depends on whether the narrow network is one that is sort of doing the kinds of things that Dan implied were bad about just, you know, not providing access to high value treatments and getting low cost that way versus really doing a good job of proactive, targeted, personalized population health management. And what's not clear at all with the ACA is which of those versions is going to happen. I mean, even if you wanted to find a good narrow network plan in the ACA, I think as your own work shows, it's really hard to do that. Yeah. You don't even, you know, it's hard to figure out, unlike Part D, you know, what drugs are on the formulary and what you actually pay for them. It's hard to figure out which doctors and hospitals are in your network, let alone what kind of quality care you're going to get. And that's really the biggest threat, I think, to some of these efforts to get very valuable, very personalized cures is, you know, a narrow network that's done right by providers who can deliver good care, or a copay system that's done right that helps put on the lower tiers the truly valuable drugs, even if they're expensive, could be a great way of getting people lower cost, innovative care. It's just that we don't have the mechanisms in place to do that right now, and I'm pretty nervous about the situation with the ACA implementation.
So I'll just make some last minute comments because I know Scott wants to wrap up. This has been a really great conversation, and what I wanted to say in closing, I think we've addressed a lot of challenges that exist right now within our healthcare system in sort of getting our arms around the concept of a cure. And I think we've talked a lot about that, and I think, you know, a lot of what's happening here is we have a breakthrough, a quantum leap in the ability to treat hepatitis C. We can do something today that we couldn't do last year, and there's a cost associated with that. And I think that has challenged our system. But what I really want to say in closing is that despite all the challenges and some of the criticism that you may be hearing and the friction and I guess the shrill tone of the conversation, there's a positive side to this, which is we're going to cure more people of hepatitis C this year than we ever have before, and next year we're going to cure even more. We have better therapies coming out later this year, and we'll have more R&D that's going to continue to really drive innovation in this area. And this is coming from all patient segments. We're seeing this in Medicaid, we're seeing this in Medicare, we're seeing this in private plans. So despite all the noise that's going out there, people are getting cured, and the patients are really seeing the value of this. The physicians are really seeing the value of this, and we really need to think about those voices and those people, because that's really what this is really about, is curing a disease.
Well, I just want to thank you all for coming and staying, coming out so early on a Friday in Washington in the summertime and joining us today. I want to thank the panel, and I hope you'll all go to the website. We're going to have a write-up, we have the video, and we also have my paper posted. So I hope you pull it down. Thanks a lot.